Bet a Million Gates. How many of you have heard of Bet a Million Gates? Not many, right? He's one of the, I think, most underrated pivotal players of the Frontier West and maybe the Gilded Age as well. It's a story of a plunger, and we'll get into a little bit later about what I mean by that. So my goal here today is to make you more familiar with the fascinating story of John Warne Gates, also known as Bet a Million Gates. First, I'm going to start with its setting. San Antonio in 1876. San Antonio was, in the 1880 census, the second largest city in Texas behind Galveston. But they were both pretty comparable, around 20,000 people. So it was a place to be in 1876 in Texas. The westward migration was in full swing. The cattle trails, well, most of them, you could say, the volume was in and around the San Antonio area. That dark area down south was where a lot of the cattle raising was done, and they would bring them up through San Antonio to a great extent and then head up the trail. So when cattle was king, San Antonio was the kingdom. Cattle drive volume had peaked out in 1871, and although there were some good years thereafter, the trend was down. Railroads were moving west, so the need to have drives to a great extent was being diminished. And rail travel in Texas was coming around. In 1876, there was not a railroad in San Antonio. It would come a year later. But Houston had rail service. Open range was coming to an end. The stage was set for the sale of Devil's Rope. Barbed wire's time had come. However, the ranchers and cowboys didn't immediately embrace the idea. Most imagined there was no way a wire like that could hold back a herd of cattle. They thought the barbed wire would harm the cattle. Cowboys were threatened by fences that would take their jobs away. And fencing would bring an end to the open range business model. That was a big part of what was going on. A little barbed wire history. The oldest patent was actually in France in 1860. In the United States, an Ohioan by the name of Lucien B. Smith holds the oldest U.S. patent from 1867. However, it was the Glidden patent from 1874 that created the environment to proliferate the idea, since it was easier to mass produce. So a gentleman, I.L. Elwood and Company, acquired rights to the Glidden patent and started his barbed wire business out of DeKalb, Illinois. DeKalb, Illinois became sort of the center of the barbed wire manufacturing business because there were three inventors there who had gone to a state fair. They'd seen a primitive idea that was kind of like barbed wire. But all three of them went away trying to improve on that, and all three of them ended up with patents and in the barbed wire business. Here's an old ad from back in the day, a newspaper ad. So they were put on 50 and 100 pound spools. Elwood hired 2 salesmen. He wasn't having a lot of luck promoting his barbed wire. He had a dealer in Houston. They had been to San Antonio numerous times, but they hadn't really achieved much. So Elwood gets more aggressive. He hires 2 hired guns, 2 drummers, they called them back in the day, to come to San Antonio and see if they could do better. One of them was Pete McManus. The other was John Warren Gates. McManus had met Gates in a hardware store in Illinois. Gates had a part ownership in a hardware store. He was a young guy, about 20 years old, but McManus realized he had a lot of charisma, a lot of sales expertise, and he could be valuable working for him as a salesman to go to Texas. Of course, these are pictures from their later years. Tried to find something earlier, but it just didn't seem to exist. So, McManus and Gates, the drummers for I.L. Elwood and Company, arrived in San Antonio in February of 1876. The pair take up residence at the Minger Hotel and start frequenting the saloons, plazas, restaurants, and so on, looking for the best place to connect with the ranchers who would be passing through town. Gates, at 20 years old, is apparently very adept at gambling. He makes many contacts at the various watering holes and saloons offering gaming opportunities. So they're at the Minger Hotel. This is a picture from 1877. So Gates spends a lot of time at the faro tables, at the poker tables, and so on, pressing flesh, developing relationships with people who could possibly be potential customers for barbed wire. And it's said that he was a guy that would gamble on almost anything. For instance, he would gamble on which drop of water would go down the pane of glass to the bottom first. That sort of person, if you know what I'm saying. I think we've all met them. This is supposedly a picture from the interior of Jack Harris Theater at that time. I haven't been able to really authenticate it, but it looks possible. Other people were already in San Antonio selling barbed wire besides just Elwood. There was what was called a H patent, which was one of those three guys in DeKalb, Illinois that had gone to the same state fair as the other two. He was already in San Antonio and selling his product through Hagen and Wolf. So McManus and Gates are making the rounds, trying to establish relationships, and they're sitting in the Watering Hole Saloon on Military Plaza. And lo and behold, this interesting guy, a medicine show guy, makes an appearance in the plaza. J.L. Lighthall, the Indian medicine man, he was called. Lighthall was different from your typical medicine show guy. What you've seen in most of the movies and read about is mostly a guy with a wagon and a soapbox. Lighthall, he took it to another level. He was called the Diamond King because he had costumes that had like diamonds all over them, and it was flashy and would catch light and attract attention. And he would make an entrance into the plaza, like Military Plaza. He'd have a walking costume trumpeter would appear announcing the beginning of the show. And Lighthall would follow in a gilded chariot, wearing a pink frock coat and a white beaver hat. If you can imagine that back in that time. Dancers, musicians, and entertainers would follow. The music would stop. He'd immediately ask for a volunteer who needed a tooth extraction. Of course, there'd be some shill in the audience. So somebody would go up on the stage, he'd immediately remove the tooth, and then he would dive into his spiel promoting his Radway's sarsaparilla resolvent syrup of, I can't pronounce that word. And Elixir is based on a little-known Native American recipes. His book, The Indian Household Medicine Guide, was also available for sale. So McManus and Gates are watching this, and they're going, you know, this guy, he has a deal going. I mean, maybe we should try to emulate that in some way. So then they start thinking about where are they going to do this. So there were a number of opportunities in the various plazas around town where you'd have a nice traffic count of people and you could stage something interesting. There was Alamo Plaza. It's from 1877. Another shot of Alamo Plaza from that time period. South Alamo Plaza, you can see like a corral at the bottom left side there, where they would, I don't know, stable horses or whatever periodically. According to the Whitty Museum, Gates and McManus focused on Alamo Plaza. You'll read some other accounts that say it was Military Plaza or even Main Plaza. So there's some debate on where they ended up exactly. A lot of the information that I collected comes from this book, Bet a Million, The Story of John Warren Gates. The problem with this book is it was printed in 1848, 37 years after Gates' death, and 72 years after their arrival in San Antonio. So, yeah, most of what you read is based on this book, but it was so much later, you kind of wonder how accurate a lot of it is. It's not footnoted, it has a bibliography, but it's kind of hard to tie the bibliography to a lot of the statements that are made in the book. So anyhow, they're going around, they looked at Alamo Plaza, they looked at Military Plaza. Just FYI, Military Plaza and Main Plaza are right next to each other, separated by San Fernando Cathedral. If you make it up that way, you know, that's kind of what it looked like back at that time. Here's a shot of Military Plaza. As you can see, there was a lot going on. All kinds of vendors and people selling vegetables, people selling canaries in cages, people selling chili, just all kinds of people selling firewood, all kinds of activities. Here's another shot, Military Plaza. Another from 1883. Still another. And another. So, Military Plaza could have been a good place, and they may have actually done something there to demonstrate the barbed wire, but we're only sure, I think, that it was done in Alamo Plaza. And then there was, Main Plaza, which was also an option, and they may have done something there. One of the problems is, I say, okay, well, let's go back and look at the newspaper, see if we can find some contemporary accounts, because, if Whitehall was doing this medicine show, there's got to be something good written about that. I couldn't find anything. You'll see his advertisements, his little posters like you saw earlier and so on, but as far as some kind of write-up about Whitehall, so far I haven't had much luck on that. Another shot of Main Plaza from 1870, 1872, and another. So, how many of you have seen the historical marker on the front of the Minger Hotel about the Bet a Million Gates? As you're going out the door, just look to your left, you'll see it there. And it states that they did this demonstration for barbed wire on Alamo Plaza. There was, and I think it may still be there, another marker that says the first demonstration was on Military Plaza, between San Fernando Cathedral and the Spanish governor's house. So that kind of pink arrow pointing to what's now City Hall is where this book by Henry and Francis T. McCallum, The Wire That Fenced the West, this is where they say the first demonstration was. Once again, the Woody Museum, in their display, they think it was at Alamo Plaza. So, I don't know how this got done, but I think maybe Gates and McManus sent a telegram to Elwood. They said, hey man, we got this neat show going on in the plaza with elephants and lions and, cattle and all kinds of bears going on demonstrating barbed wire. Can you send us some more money, please? This is the best account that I found on the barbed wire demonstration. It's from 1910, also well after these guys arrived in San Antonio in 1876. But this is Pete McManus that's being interviewed, one of the two guys that was actually there and had stayed in San Antonio as a barbed wire and steel salesman following this event. He said it was on Alamo Plaza, and he was very matter of fact about it. He didn't mention any kind of Cirque du Soleil performance. He just said, yeah, Gates and I built a corral with posts and barbed wire, and we herded the cattle into the corral. It held, and we took the ranchers over to the Meager Hotel, and we wrote up business. And they wrote up a lot of it. McManus was actually the number one barbed wire salesman of all time. So Gates was a plunger, as I said. He wasn't satisfied with just being a barbed wire salesman. He went back to Illinois and he tried to convince Elwood to give him a piece of the company. He and McManus had done such great things down in San Antonio. They successfully introduced the product to the market. They got past all those objections that the ranchers and cowboys had, and they were selling the stuff like crazy. Give me a piece of the company. How many times do you see a salesman succeed at that? But Gates wouldn't take no for an answer. He leaves Elwood and he starts his own, what was called a moonshine barbed wire company. He didn't have a patent, but he was going to make barbed wire anyway. He was going to sell it, and he sold a lot of it. With the money from that, he takes full advantage of the situation, acquisitions, mergers, dispositions, and so on, and becomes a steel magnate, owning a steel company and diversifying into other areas as well. So if you're wondering where the Bet a Million Gates name came from, Gates and a friend went to London to a horse race in 1900, and Gates bet $70,000 on a horse, which, at the time was a lot of money. He won $600,000. But being the promoter that he was, somehow he morphed that into Bet a Million Gates. So he turned his $70,000 bet into $1 million. And that kind of stuck with him, that name. Gates got into the railroad business. He had rails running from north down into the Beaumont, Port Arthur area. He had an employee there by the name of Giles who contacted him and said, there's this guy here, Patillo Higgins. He's an oil driller, and he's been, mucking around in the Salt Dome area, drilling. He's run out of money, but he has a convincing story, and there may be something to what he's trying to do here. So Gates travels to Port Arthur, meets with Higgins, and they form a company, the Texas Oil Company. Gates extracts 46% out of Higgins, though. What do they say? The golden rule, the guy with the gold makes the rules. Gates had the gold. So Higgins Well comes in on January 10th, 1901, producing 3.5 million barrels of oil in the first year and 17.4 million barrels in year 2. So the Spindletop field rapidly developed into an enormous oil play, and stripper wells are still producing at Spindletop today, 122 years later. And that picture at the bottom right, it's kind of interesting because the one at the left was in 1901. That's in October of 1902, if I read it correctly. Back at that time, you could buy an oil lease that was like 10 feet by 12 feet or something. Erect a derrick and you'd start producing oil, and they would just deplete the heck out of the reservoir in no time. But at the time, that was what they did. But they got away from that, obviously. So now Gates is a real player. Not only has he succeeded in the barbed wire business, the steel business, the railroad business, he's now an owner of one of the largest oil wells ever found, and he diversifies into pipelines, refineries, and tankers to transport oil. Then he decides to play his hand on Wall Street. He moves into the Waldorf Astoria and buys a seat. He and his son Charles buy a seat on the New York Stock Exchange, and they operated out of the Waldorf Astoria in that trading room that you can see there in the smaller picture. The Panic of 1907 took place. At that time, they didn't get wiped out like a lot of people did, but they decided to get out of the stock trading business after the Panic of 1907. So it all began right here, folks, selling barbed wire at the Meager Hotel. So one final takeaway from my presentation is the correct pronunciation of barbed wire. And I think I have this theory that Gates and McManus, these two carpetbaggers from Illinois, were going around in the gambling halls, not having a lot of luck, and maybe they kind of tried to get rid of their Yankee accent a little bit. They figured out that barbed wire was not the correct pronunciation in Texas. It's barbed wire. Repeat after me. You're going to find this useful if you go tell people about this fantastic story you heard about barbed wire. So repeat after me. Barbed wire. Okay. Now let's say it again, hyphenated a little faster. Barbed wire. Okay, now let's make it one word with two syllables. Barbed wire. Okay, folks, you've succeeded in learning how to sell barbed wire.